Welcome to Literacy RX podcast hosted by SpeechMed, where we delve into the evolving world of healthcare and explore how language and literacy shape patient outcomes.
All right, welcome back to the Literacy RX podcast, where we're deep diving into the issues of patient literacy and language. I'm Jessica Shin from SpeechMed, here with Susan Perry, the CEO of SpeechMed, and we are continuing our conversation with Dr. Chethan Ramprasad. So, Dr. Ramprasad, in part one of our conversation with you, we were discussing some of the challenges that patients face when they're preparing for the colonoscopies. But in the second part, I want to shift focus to groundbreaking solutions in the field. So you have an upcoming paper that's going to be published, and it's about using AI as a tool for improving patient bowel prep. So tell us a little bit more about what made you want to explore AI as a tool for gastroenterology and for colonoscopies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started with the problem, which was me in my training in my fellowship. I noticed that there was such a high rate of poor bowel preparation for colonoscopy, inadequate bowel preparation. At least 1 out of 4 patients, sometimes 1 out of 3 of my patients would have inadequate bowel preparation.
Mm.
So I thought in my mind, so much in the world, and this was about 2021, had started to circle around artificial intelligence and how it was creating so many solutions for existing problems. So I actually thought in my mind, there has to be some kind of way that I can use AI to help a common problem that I'm experiencing on a daily basis, in which I feel tremendously bad for the patients who are prepping but have still inadequate bowel preparation. And I also thought about my first year of fellowship in the hospital, in which we mostly do hospital care and not really very much in the outpatient colonoscopy world. But in the hospital, when we do colonoscopies for patients who are already hospitalized, we oftentimes will monitor the bowel prep with a nurse, with the hospital doctors, and we have constant communication between the endoscopy unit and the patients who are hospitalized upstairs in the hospital. And we monitor the bowel prep and we look at the stool output. And there's a point in time where we start texting photos of the bowel prep, or we start to describe what the bowel prep looks like. And it usually plays out like this. The nurse who is taking care of that patient up in the hospital floor will say, I think the bowel prep is almost complete. I can see through it. It looks clear. There is not a lot of small chunks. There are no dark, obstructing blocks in this bowel prep. It looks like a good bowel prep. And they might send a photo and it say, it looks like lemonade. It looks like urine. It's clear. This looks like a good bowel prep. Then we say, yes, we agree. It looks like a good bowel prep. Please bring that patient to the endoscopy unit. We will do the procedure. Second way that goes, we communicate with the team. The team says the bowel prep seems to not be going very well. When he or she has bowel movements, it's very dark. I can't see anything. And it looks like a very cloudy bowel prep that is coming out. This is the photo. Look how dark and cloudy it looks. So that was my experience clinically. I would spend so much of my time communicating with the hospital patients, nurses, and teams. And I said to myself, there has to be a way that we can use this same process, but for patients who are coming for colonoscopies as outpatients. And I knew that image classification AI was a kind of an old concept in artificial intelligence. If you think about all the different types of AI, this is way before language models, in which we see ChatGPT taken off, and other large language models that will basically text out. A more simple version of AI is simply to use a computer vision to analyze photos and tell you what is clear and what is dark.
Okay.
So I designed my study when I was a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and I collected images from patients as part of a research study in which they took photos of their bowel prep, and I instructed them to take the last photo of their last bowel movement before coming for their
Mm-hmm.
colonoscopy. And I took those photos and I wanted to add a true value to what that colonoscopy preparation was. So I took the before colonoscopy preparation output photo of the toilet bowl from of their stool output, and together I tied it with what their actually colonoscopy truly looked like after we did the procedure. So that way I was able to add a gold standard to what we were looking at, not just it looks clear, this is a good prep, but truly it looks like a good prep and the actual colonoscopy was a good prep.
Okay.
So I took those two variables and tied them together with AI and made an algorithm that can analyze a photo of stool output and say if it looks with high certainty, high probability that it looks like a good enough prep, or if it does not look like a good enough prep, in which it would suggest that the patient takes more of that bowel prep.
Okay.
So it is an algorithm system based off of text messages between providers and patients to be able to, ahead of time before the procedure, know if their preparation is good enough.
And so are you saying that you went far as to do some kind of correlation between the AI result and the Boston Bowel Prep score?
Exactly. So I
Okay.
use those two variables to be able to train the algorithm so that it
Mm-hmm.
has a gold standard to add to its power.
Wow. So
Yeah,
that really ties together that metric that the physician that you're using, as well as before the patient even comes in, how well they're prepared.
Exactly.
That's
And
incredible.
yeah, thank you. And I think very importantly to note, and I do note this in my paper that's going to be in press shortly. It's an accepted publication. It's going to be in press. I note in my paper, and I think it's important to note, our patients really enjoyed that process. When I first came up with the idea, I got a lot of feedback from our IRB, which is the approval for doing
Mm-hmm.
sort of ethical research. And many people said patients are not going to be willing to take photos of their own toilet bowl. That's something that people are very uncomfortable with. My answer was yes, I think it's unusual, but there is so much anxiety and uncertainty about this procedure that
Mm-hmm.
patients want more and more information about
right.
what it
I,
Yeah.
is. They
yeah,
want to be engaged with this. It is an uncomfortable area for anybody to talk about, but that doesn't mean you avoid it. It
Mm-hmm.
means that it oftentimes needs a little bit more instruction. So I'll tell you this, our patients who came to do their procedure would show the photos, even though they already texted it. They arrived to the endoscopy unit on their phones. They had the photos. They would show our nurses, look how good my bowel prep looks. It looks clear. Their understanding of the preparation certainly increased. Their engagement in the process increased.
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side, our nurses in the endoscopy unit actually really enjoyed having it. So much so that when I finished my collection after 2 months, a couple months later, they asked me to restart the study because they felt like it really helped their
mhm,
process in checking in the patients. So I was very excited about doing the study. And my current progress with it, I want to see where I can take it next. But in a large way, it's a proof of concept. It's a understanding in many different angles of what could be done, what needs to be done in the field. And I think it only shows how much work can really help these patients.
yeah, I totally agree.
And, I can see a use case potentially in the future where, every time the patient do their thing, like have to go to the bathroom, they take a picture and it provides them with a progress about, all right, you got to
Yeah,
go, kind of an encouragement, kind of gamifying this whole process so that the
right.
patient is more clear. So does the patient get acknowledgement like, okay, your thing was great and we gave you a great score for your efforts in bowel prep?
Right. Great question. And I really wanted this first project that I did to be a phase one
Mm-hmm.
building of the algorithm.
Okay.
So importantly, I did not roll out the prediction part of the algorithm. So essentially what I did is gather data, and I know that the patients enjoy it. I know that the endoscopy unit enjoys it, but we have not yet rolled out that progress part of what it is. So no patients actually received an analysis of what
Mm-hmm.
the algorithm said. They simply were just looking at their bowel prep, taking a photo and sending it.
Okay.
So I think we would see in a phase two, the patients would feel very much more engaged in what they were doing. They would feel a little bit more guidance in how they were needing to prep for it. And so I think they would. I think they would
Okay.
fully understand that progress arm. But for full clarity, I have not run that phase two part. My study was more of a phase one data collection part to get the algorithm to be more robust.
And it seems like there's a lot of benefits for providers and the colonoscopy facilities to know ahead of time whether the patient is prepared or not. So I know in part one of our conversation, we were talking a little bit about what are the implications when patients don't prep correctly, but are there any implications for the facilities and for providers when a patient doesn't come in well prepared?
Absolutely. The first point would be about access to colonoscopies. As I mentioned earlier, there is a long wait to get a colonoscopy. It can be
Mm,
months, it can
okay.
be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. One of the things I like to talk about the most is the difficulty with access. So if a patient has an unprepped colonoscopy or they're not able to get their colonoscopy, that is a spot that could have gone to somebody else who may
Oh,
have really urgently needed that
sure.
colonoscopy
Sure.
on the time that they needed it. Maybe they are someone with family history of colon cancer. Maybe they are somebody who's been having symptoms of bleeding or abdominal pain or a change in their bowel habits, and they don't know why that's happening. So I think that's the first point, is just that it is taking the spot of somebody who may truly need it
Mm-hmm.
if that procedure is not done. I think secondly, but certainly very importantly, is the money aspect of keeping the endoscopy unit afloat, keeping it efficient and working so that it can accommodate and take care of patients. If there is so many cancellations in a day because the preparation is not working, there is huge losses in terms of a business aspect to the endoscopy unit or to the hospital. And a vast majority of endoscopy units are not owned by these big hospital systems. A lot of them are
Mm-hmm.
owned by smaller entities, may it be a private practice, a doctor-owned endoscopy unit, and the business side of that may struggle greatly if there are so many cancellations. Or I may even turn it on itself and say it is more business friendly for a hospital system to be more efficient, to have fewer cancellations. In every time a colonoscopy is canceled, may it be for prep or otherwise, there is several $1,000s lost in revenue for each one of those colonoscopies.
Wow.
And it's always uncomfortable to talk about money when it's about healthcare, because we are talking about lives, quality of life, healthcare. But I think it's important to note that if these units cannot stay afloat,
Mm-hmm.
if they're not able to run efficiently as a business, then they're not able to provide the service to the patients that they need to.
Sure.
So if that endoscopy unit is inefficient due to cancellations or poor prep, they do lose a great deal of money.
Okay. I think that's a very important point that you mentioned, that this poor prep affects not just the patients, but also the providers, insurance companies. Um,
Exactly.
Yeah, and in addition, if there's poor prep and the colonoscopy isn't done and a patient can't get in, a lot of times there are health implications.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think as we were discussing earlier, with all the instructions that have to be in place for the colonoscopy, There is, first of all, the preparation itself. There's also the fact that people need a ride to go home after the procedure,
Mm-hmm.
which is oftentimes misunderstood because some patients think they can just take an Uber or a Lyft home after their procedure. But it truly needs to be someone that they know well and trust who goes with them in the Uber, if it is an Uber.
Sure.
And a very common thing that I experience in my own practice, which oftentimes maybe 1 out of 3 or maybe even more of my patients are non-English speakers. I
Okay.
I'm really like the huge diversity that I see in my patient panel. I
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of patients who speak Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Haitian Creole. I have a huge mix of patients. And it is true, as we discussed, that the preparation quality can be a lot less with patients who don't speak English because the instructions are not well understood. And I would even say that oftentimes it's difficult to really follow the other instructions to stop taking the medicines that may be needed to be stopped. That's a
Mm-hmm.
big one,
Right.
especially with all
Yeah.
these medicines I mentioned earlier with
Yeah.
Ozempic or Trulicity, these obesity or diabetes medicines. If a patient has not stopped those meds, that case is canceled for the safety of the procedure.
Wow. Okay.
If the patient does not have a ride, does not have a friend or family member to come pick them up, the case is canceled. So it is a huge number of those that happen due to a poor understanding, or I could even just say poor communication from the endoscopy unit to the patients about those requirements. And we could say that yes, it's written down, it's on the piece of paper, it's online on the website, but as we talked about before, everyone's very busy. They're
Mm-hmm.
concerned about their health and they've taken the steps to get the colonoscopy and to remember all the other steps when their family members are all working during the weekdays. Usually our endoscopies happen Monday through Friday. So somebody
Mm-hmm.
usually has to take off work. And so I
Right.
do have a lot of patients who say to me, I'm sorry, I didn't know that someone was supposed to pick me up, and I don't have anybody to pick me up right now. Everybody's at work.
Okay.
So it is a very tough situation.
Man, it sounds like just the problems compound when that happens.
Right.
Well, I'm going to change the direction of the conversation just a little bit to talk about something that's emerging in the world. So, obviously, last week the World Health Organization declared that Mpox or monkeypox outbreak is a public health emergency. So you're familiar with this. You wrote a paper 2 years ago about, rectal lesions for Mpox outbreak. So can you talk a little bit about Mpox, how you got involved, and what signs the public and the medical community should be looking out for?
Absolutely. And it's always frightening to see new infectious diseases come through the news. Sometimes it cycles through. When I had written this paper 2 years ago, that had been the initial spike. And
Mm-hmm.
now, as you mentioned, there is a second spike that we are seeing. I wrote this paper because at that point, there was a lot of discussion about what monkeypox was and how it was actually affecting a very vulnerable population in the LGBTQ population. And because it was emerging, but there was so little understanding of what it was, I was really motivated to write about it. I was fortunate to write it with a few of my colleagues who are in infectious disease,
Okay.
and I had another colleague who was in gastroenterology. So we wrote it as a paper to help other doctors understand what was happening and to propose management of what could be done in terms of helping people who had these kind of lesions. And the real crux of the paper is talking about supportive management if these painful lesions are found. It also discussed if there was bleeding, how to treat these kind of bleeding lesions, which oftentimes overlaps with how we treat other types of ulcers that we see. But certainly, like we have seen with other viruses, monkeypox and how we see it maybe in the last month or two, or how we see it in the future may change in how we have understood it in the past. But I was fortunate to write that because it was something that went out into press very quickly after we were able to gather some information clinically from it.
Okay. And, is there a difference in how the medical community is preparing now compared to 2 years ago?
I don't know if we have a lot of preparation for it as it is now.
Okay.
It is a It is something that had occurred years ago very quickly in the American population, and we had been seeing it in a lot of our patients. And I think right now, as it is, it seems to be mostly in preparation for it possibly coming here in uncontrolled levels.
Okay.
So I think our understanding of that is going to be changing very quickly on a week to
Mm-hmm.
week, day to day basis. Fortunately, in the last year, I have not seen any patients with monkeypox, certainly not in the GI tract. And it's hard to know if variations of the virus will affect mostly skin or respiratory, or may it also be in the GI tract. So, to answer your question, I think it's too early to say. In
Okay.
my current practice, I have not seen any. And it seems at this point that maybe what we are doing is being more aware of what could possibly come as a second hit,
Mm-hmm.
whereas years ago we were describing what we had been seeing right in front of our eyes.
Okay. Well, before we wind down this conversation with you, are there any questions that you think we haven't asked you? I know we threw a lot at you.
No, I think it's a really great thing that you are focused on this area. I can say from personal experience, because of my patient population and having worked now in 9 different endoscopy units and hospitals, that it is greatly needed to have some sort of system in place to help patients understand things. I don't think that could really be overstated. I think
Mm-hmm.
we in the medical field assume so much about patients because we do this every day, but that doesn't mean that the patients do this every day. So I think the more use of technology, the more that exists outside of hospitals to help patients, the better. I think there's a huge need financially for everything that you mentioned with insurance companies, with hospitals, with making sure we respect people's time and their families' time. So I think all around there's great need, and I think it would work really well to have any sort of support.
This is great. Thank you so much for this really insightful conversation. And I know I'm going to be watching and listening to this multiple times. So, how can our listeners follow your work and connect with you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, for now, most of my work has been published online, and it's online through PubMed or through other academic sources. I think stay tuned. I don't have a channel in which I can share it more easily, but stay tuned, and I'll put out the type of work that's coming out soon.
Great.
Thank you so much. I mean, I learned so much, and I'm a patient frequently, so it was really a great, and I think that people are going to enjoy listening to you.
Great. It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking about it as well.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramprasad. And I encourage our audience to watch the first part of our conversation. We're going to have a link to it down below, but power to the patient. Thank you so much.
Thank you.